So the Bible passage will be appearing on the screen. It's Romans 3, verses 1 to 20. And just before we read the passage, this is a bit of a disclaimer. It is not one of the easiest Bible passages to understand and make sense of. But my hope is, as we consider together these inspired words of the Apostle Paul, that we can make some sense of them, and we will be challenged and encouraged by what we discover. It's perhaps wise for me to tell you that the first 8 verses that we'll be reading is Paul having an imaginary argument with someone who may object to what he's saying. So it sounds a bit strange because he's arguing, it appears, with himself, but he's imagining the objections to what he is saying. So that's the first 8 verses. And then once we get to verse 12, you'll see lots of quotation marks. And this is Paul quoting the Old Testament as part of his case that he's making. So there are lots of quotes from the Old Testament scriptures. So once you kind of understand that, it does make a little bit more sense. But this morning I was listening to David Suchet read this because he's a professional. And so I cannot in any way match David Suchet's reading, but it does make more sense the way you read it. So here goes, Romans chapter 3, verses 1 through to 20. What advantage then is there in being a Jew? Or what value is there in circumcision? Much in every way. First of all, the Jews have been entrusted with the very words of God. What if some are unfaithful? Will their unfaithfulness nullify God's faithfulness? Not at all. Let God be true, and every human being a liar, as it is written, so that you may be proved right when you speak and prevail when you judge. But if our unrighteousness brings out God's righteousness more clearly, what shall we say? That God is unjust in bringing his wrath on us? I am using a human argument. Certainly not. If that were so, how could God judge the world? Someone might argue, if my falsehood enhances God's truthfulness and so increases his glory, why am I still condemned as a sinner? Why not say, as some slanderously claim that we say, let us do evil that good may result. Their condemnation is just. What shall we conclude then? Do we, as Jews, have any advantage? Not at all. First, for we have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under the power of sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one. There is no one who understands. There is no one who seeks God. All have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves, their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. We can go on to the next slide. A complaint that people often make is that the news, the national news, is full of bad news stories. And there appears to be very little good news in the headlines, in our national newspapers, on our TV news, on the radio news. And you can see on the screen some of the front page newspaper headlines in the week that has just gone by. All those are taken from national newspapers. They're dominated by bad news stories. The cost of living crisis, war and food shortages, racism, crumbling school buildings. Even the good news on Friday, if you think it's good news, that Doncaster is now a city rather than a town, but it in no way balances the bad news and the severity and seriousness of the bad news in our nation and in our world. And just go on to the next slide. In the opening 3 chapters of Paul's letter to the Romans, there is a lot of bad news. And that includes chapter 3, what we've just read, those first 20 verses. And at the heart of the bad news is that in our natural state, human beings will never be in right relationship with God. That is what Paul is getting over. In our natural state, we will never be in right relationship with God. In our natural state, we'll be forever disconnected with the one who made us, the one who loves us. A great chasm comes between us. That is what Paul is saying. And what I want to do this morning is just to pick out 3 aspects of this bad news as the Apostle Paul tells it in this passage. Before, I do want to highlight some good news. It isn't all bad news, but unfortunately now, I was going to say, you'll have to wait a fortnight for the good news. You've actually got to wait 3 weeks, because next week we're back in chapter 2, which is more bad news. And then the following week is Pentecost Sunday, so that isn't Romans. And it's the week after. My friend Jim Bonham, he gets the privilege of the latter part of Romans 3, which is all good news with a tiny bit of bad news. But it is good news. But there is a glimpse of it in our passage. And that is the disconnection that we find. That is man's and woman's natural state. So let's move on. The first piece of bad news is about our unrighteousness. All these words begin with U. Not often do you find things beginning with the letter U, but unrighteousness is the issue. It's the word Paul uses to describe our disconnection with God. We find it in in lots of the verses, but particularly in verse 5, we find it, our unrighteousness. And this word and variations of it are found 4 times in this passage. And it's a long word, and it's a word that might cause us to get a bit confused. What does Paul mean when he talks of righteousness and unrighteousness? Well, it relates to 2 things. One is about relationship, what it says there, and the other is to do with lifestyle. First of all, relationship. Righteousness means being in right relationship with God. That's why you get the first bit right, righteousness. It's being right with God. That is its primary meaning, perhaps its most important meaning, being right with God, being in right standing with him. And Paul tells us that what prevents a person being right with God is our tendency to want to go our own way. And in verse 12, Paul tells us that all have turned away. That's what he says. My way versus God's way. Isn't it amazing that Frank Sinatra song, My Way, is one of the most popular songs played at funerals? Who would ever choose that at a funeral? Certainly not a Christian. I did it my way. That is the problem. God says we do it his way. We go God's way. It is the only way to go. That is the way of righteousness. To be right with God, to go his way. Yet human beings were made to go God's way, not my way. We were created for a close relationship with God, our Father. We were made to know him, to love him, and to serve him, to go his way. So that's the first meaning. When Paul talks about our unrighteousness, he says in our natural state, we are not right with God. We're not right with him. But then there's another meaning. It's the one that perhaps is more popular, the one that we're kind of more aware of. And that's to do with lifestyle. Righteousness refers also to living rightly in the way God intends, right living. And in verses 7 and 9 and verse 20, Paul uses the word sin or sinner to express aspects of our unrighteousness. So not only are we not right with God, we have this tendency to not live right when we're in our natural state. And at its very simplest, sin is this ability we have to mess up. There is a Christian writer, you perhaps wouldn't want the way he expresses it, but it got a lot of attention in the media. And I'm not going to actually repeat the word he used, but you maybe can guess it. He said sin is our tendency to be able to, and it was a 4-letter word. Not mess up, but a different 4-letter word. And that perhaps speaks to many out in the world because they understand what it is to mess up. Is there a person out there that has not at some time or other messed up? Our mess ups reveal themselves in our words, our thoughts, and our actions. As any parent will tell you, it's amazing how people say, oh, how innocent, how sweet they look. You only have to be a parent to know it isn't really like that, is it? The youngest of children want their own way. That is the way we are made in our natural state, to want our own way. We even have the expression, don't we? The terrible twos. Or is it the terrible threes, the terrible fours? And it goes on, doesn't it? And what is the terrible twos meant to say? It's meant to say that 2-year-olds can be very defiant. They can be unruly in their behavior. Look in the mirror. See yourself. That is our natural state, isn't it? And these verses 12 and onwards, these quotes that Paul makes from the Old Testament, mainly the Psalms are being quoted. There are 2 other quotes, I think one from Ecclesiastes, another one from Isaiah. There are lots of quotes. And in these quotes, Paul is at length speaking about our wrongdoing, verse 12, our damaging words, that's verses 13 and 14. They speak of broken relationships, verses 15, 16, and 17. And then they speak, don't we know this in our world, in Ukraine and elsewhere? They speak of violence and bloodshed and a lack of peace, verses 15 to 18. This is sin manifested in lifestyle and behavior. They paint a dismal picture of human unrighteousness, this ability we have to mess things up. If we move to the next slide. But a second point that Paul makes is that this unrighteousness is universal. People's unrighteousness is universal. Paul in verse 10 tells us there is no one righteous, not even one. Then in verse 12, all have turned away. All people everywhere in the world have fallen short of God's standards. Paul is emphatic. No one is repeated 6 times in this passage. When you listen to David Suchet read the Bible, he puts great emphasis on this no one, not even one, all. All is repeated twice. No one repeated 6 times. Do we get the message? No one can stand before God and say, not me, not me. And in the first few verses, Paul tells us that the Jewish people, chosen by God, his own race, chosen to be his faithful people, continually turned away from him. Although, as Paul is at pains to point out, God remained faithful to them, yet they did not prove faithful to him. All people, even the Jewish people. But then Paul goes on to say, all people at all times, all generations. It's a problem for all people in all generations. Hence the bottom picture, from the earliest to the man with his smartphone. Nothing has changed. Listen to this newspaper quote and just ask yourself for a minute, when was this written? This newspaper quote. Are you ready? We defy anyone who goes about with their eyes open to deny that there is, as never before, an attitude on the part of young folk which is best described as grossly thoughtless, rude, and utterly selfish. Now, you might think that this was written in very recent times. In fact, it was written nearly 100 years ago. Probably every single person to whom this is referring are now dead. It was published in the Hull Daily Mail under the headline, The Conduct of Young People. You see, people in every generation have behaved in ways that fall short of God's standards. We might believe there was a golden period sometime in the past when everybody behaved. Everybody did what was right. You were sadly mistaken. And you can even find things written in Roman times, written in exactly the same vein about young people. Nothing has changed. No wonder Paul says in verse 9, all are under the power of sin. Let's move on. The last bit of bad news. Well, it can be bad news, or it can be news that we don't need to worry about. A third point is made, and that is, if we continue to be disconnected from God in this life, then we'll be likewise disconnected from him for all eternity. Disconnected now, then disconnected forever. That's what Paul is saying. And in verse 19, Paul speaks of our ultimate accountability to God. And in verse 6, Paul says that everybody in the world will be judged. Everybody. There are consequences ahead for each one of us. There are many people in this world who have a belief in the existence of one God. But they feel it will be all right on the night. It will be okay when they one day face God. They think they've done enough to get by with God. Maybe that describes people, some people in your family. It may describe some people in your neighborhood. It may even describe you. But Paul makes it very clear in verse 20, the final verse that we read, that no one will be declared right with God. Nobody will be declared righteous, that word, right with God, by the good works that they do, no matter how wonderful those good works appear to be. We all fall short. Now that's pretty bad news, isn't it? We just go on to the next slide. It's all there in one hit. Our unrighteousness, going our own way instead of God's way. It's universal. It affects all people everywhere. And we're all accountable to God. So you may be saying, where is the good news this morning? It's all bad news. Well, let me give you an illustration, an example. When you visit the doctor, there are 3 words you do not want to hear. Here are the 3 words. It's bad news. You do not want to hear those words. If you do, as I did, it makes your heart sink. It's not nice. It brings you up sharp. But if those 3 words are followed by the doctor saying these 3 words, this is treatable, then it makes a world of difference, doesn't it? This is treatable. And that is what Paul gives hints of in this passage. He doesn't come out with it fully. But the moment we get to verse 21, I wish I had verse 21, and it starts with, but now. But now. In other words, there is really good news, but now. And in fact, those verses, those quotes from the Psalms, all appear bad when you read them. But if you read the surrounding verses in those Psalms, there is good news on the other side of those verses, that God has not forgotten his people. So let's have the next slide. Here is the good news. The good news is that our unrighteousness and our sin is treatable. God himself in Jesus has provided the remedy. And it's a remedy, as we've seen, that's needed by all. There's not one person in this world now or has ever been that does not need this remedy that God in Jesus has provided. It's needed by all, it's available to all, and it is, more to the point, effective for all who believe. And in verse 3, Paul speaks of God's faithfulness. Even when his people were unfaithful, God is faithful. Verse 3. And then in verse 5, it speaks of God's righteousness. Now, this is important. So let's get to the final slide, which is oh so clever if it works. The last slide, Chris. There is the chasm, but here is the bridge to where God is. God is faithful. That's what this passage says. God is faithful. And in Jesus, God has done all that's necessary to reconcile us to himself. The good news is that God has made a way by which we can be put right with God. A way, and this is the point, a way that makes us righteous in God's sight. And he's bridged that chasm that separates us, and he's dealt with the disconnection. And he comes to the rescue of those like you and I who are helpless to do anything about this chasm. And you see, we become right with God when we put our trust in Jesus and his saving work on the cross. And you see, God's righteousness is a status that's credited to us, not because there's anything good in us, but it's God's gracious gift to us. He credits us with his righteousness. We do not stand in our own righteousness. That's why we can never stand before God and say, well, you know all the good things I did. I set up a food bank. I did this. I did the other. And God will say, but did you ever know me? Were you connected to me? And we can know for certain that if we put our trust in Jesus, then we will be in right standing with God. It's a thing of a moment. It's not a work of a lifetime. Actually, the thing that is the work of a lifetime is that fancy word, sanctification. That is allowing God's Holy Spirit to change us day by day so that the power of sin is less effective in our lives. We're saved from the penalty of sin by God's righteous act, but it's a work of a lifetime to deal with those thoughts, those actions, those words. And with God's help, we can overcome. Now, isn't that good news? Isn't that good news? And you know, if you say, why does Paul lay it on so thickly? 3 chapters of bad news. But you know, I've come to think this. It's only when we appreciate the bad news of our condition without Christ. It's only when we are in the doctors and he says it's bad news and our heart sinks, are we truly, truly appreciative of the good news that something can be done. Something can be done. And God has done all that is necessary. Now that's good news, isn't it? And doesn't that put the bad news somewhat in the shade? You might think we could have left this morning going, God, that was gloomy, wasn't it? What was it about? Oh, our unrighteousness. Oh, it's everybody. There's no escape. Oh, we're ultimately accountable. There's consequences. It's doom and gloom. But it isn't it. We need the doom and gloom in order to appreciate the light. So I leave you with that. Amen.